Okay, so good morning, everyone. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Dan Patefield and I lead the cybersecurity program at techUK. I'm delighted to welcome you all to our third techUK Cyber Innovation Den this morning, the second and hopefully last that's taking place virtually. Our techUK cybersecurity program exists to champion and support innovation in cybersecurity across all regions of the UK, and we're really looking forward to hearing from our competition entrants later this morning. When we did this event virtually last year, we were sure that we'd be back in person here in St. Bride's Street for this year's event, hopefully next year. The pandemic continues to obviously spring up new challenges, and as we'll touch on throughout the agenda, the cyber threats and challenges we face are constantly evolving, whether that be seeing increases in ransomware attacks or high-profile breaches such as SolarWinds that we've seen in the last 12 months. Fortunately, in the UK, we're still in an enviable position internationally with a world-leading technical authority in the NCSC, a burgeoning SME environment developing leading-edge technologies, and a mature public-private partnership which has stood us in good stead, I think, over the last 16 months. Government continues to act purposefully in the cyber domain as well, both in terms of developing the sector, but also in ensuring that the UK has that key national security capability that I'm sure we'll touch on during the day. I'm sure we all welcome the announcements in the integrated review, including the formation of the National Cyber Force. And as industry, we look forward to working with government on plans for the next national strategy due later this year. We'll explore both sides of this progress throughout the day today, and we look forward to being joined by the Minister for Digital Infrastructure, Matt Warman, later on. I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank our competition sponsor, UK CloudX, who have very kindly joined us for the second year running. Events like this simply can't happen without the engagement of our members like Jerry and the team, who you'll hear a little bit more from shortly. They also don't happen without all of you, and I'd like to thank you all for your continued engagement in the programme and hope you find this morning's session informative and useful. Please do get involved in the discussions throughout the day, either in the chat or online at the hashtag cyber innovation. Throughout this morning, we'll try and pose as many of the questions that come through as possible, and the team will pick up questions either in the chat function or in the Q&A function. I know it's slightly confusing having two different ones. So that's enough from me. I'm going to hand over to our first speaker this morning, who's Lee Rendell from Kaspersky. And Lee's going to kick us off with a bit of an exploration of the current trends we're seeing in the threat landscape to give us that context before we look at what we can do as a sector throughout this morning. So government, industry and academia working together. Over to you, Lee.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Yeah, it's great to be here. Obviously, virtually. In this case, you can see I've got quite a snazzy sock behind me. It's not really there. So yeah, great to be here. I'm just going to start sharing my screen and we run through. So we're going to go over a little bit regarding Kaspersky's threat landscape. So kind of what we're seeing, how we're seeing it, and that's obviously going to be a bit more relevant to Kaspersky itself. So everything you see in this particular presentation is relevant to Kaspersky's figures only. So it's part of the picture, it's not the full picture. So some of the numbers are actually scarier than what you're actually seeing on screen, because obviously, unfortunately, Kaspersky isn't installed on every single computer in the world. So obviously there are levels of detections that we don't see. So yeah, and this would be kind of a Q1 roundup from this year, talking about a little bit about the previous year, and then kind of some of the trends and predictions that we see moving forward, and so on. So just the agenda, as I said, running through very quickly. We only have a short period of time, so yeah, what we see and how we see it, what trends we see developing from the start of the year over the past 18 months during the pandemic, and how we see that kind of moving forward into the future as well. And then we'll touch on a little bit about some of the areas and ways in which we recommend to start to improve your cybersecurity posture. So a little bit about kind of what we see. Obviously, back when we first started in the industry, we were detecting about one sample every hour. it was simple enough for a few engineers to reverse engineer and so on. By about 2006, that was down to 1 sample every minute, and that's no longer efficient for kind of signature-based detections. That's when we needed to start adding in more efficient technology methods, behavioral analysis, and so on, and kind of post-execution analysis of a file, purely because there was just too many samples to create databases a number of times. By 2011, that was up to 1 sample every second. And really, that coincided with the rise in mobile malware. So threat actors and cybercrime gangs utilizing Android specifically about 98% of the time. Android devices as a key attack vector. It's easy, efficient for them. We don't secure them in the same way, and yeah, there's huge amounts of vulnerabilities inside different versions of Android skins from the different phone manufacturers that aren't patched. And also that kind of coincided with the rise of APTs. It's not to say APTs didn't exist before then. APT is an advanced persistent threat. It's this kind of top tier of attacks that we see and monitor and investigate. And obviously they existed prior to that. Stuxnet was kind of 2008, 2009. And the chances are they did exist prior to that. We just no one really knew about them in that sense. And then around about 2016, we're up to 3.5 new pieces of malware every second. And now in present day, Kaspersky detects and processes about 5.2 brand new pieces of malware every second. That equates to about 450,000 new samples every day. And we process about 1.6 million threats a day. So we're seeing kind of huge numbers, and I'm sure other vendors will be seeing some similar, and there'll be overlap, there'll be stuff that we see and they don't, and vice versa. So talking a little bit about how we see the threat landscape, we kind of split it up into kind of 3 tiers. And I'm going to go through kind of the current numbers of what we're seeing in terms of each kind of tier, essentially. So right at the bottom is a 90%. This is what we kind of class as opportunistic attacks or mass attacks or accidental infection, commodity attacks, really, where there's no specific targets in mind. They're generally there to make money. So that would be stuff like standard ransomware, for example, online banking attacks and phishing campaigns and so on and so forth. And they make up about 90% of the threat landscape and detections that we see. In the 9.9% is when we start to look at more kind of advanced, more evasive threats, where their target's a bit more bespoke. They're going after a specific industry or specific set of companies, and they're tailoring their social engineering campaigns accordingly. So they're using smishing as well as phishing, so using text message phishing as well, and trying to tailor that to a particular organization, getting a better understanding, doing their reconnaissance. But then generally on the back end, they're using known TTPs, tactics, techniques, and procedures. So we generally can we understand what they try to do and how they try to do it. And in a lot of cases, they're using off-the-shelf payloads and off-the-shelf malware that they're purchasing on the back end. So harder to spot the initial intrusion, but generally the malware is quite similar to the ones that are on the 90%. And then right at the top tier is these what we class as in the industry as APTs, advanced persistent threats, and these are generally state sponsored in a lot of cases, so government enabled attacks, or at least and also kind of highly motivated, monetized, and sophisticated cybercrime gangs that have a huge amount of resources and expertise, and they're creating very, very bespoke attacks, spending a lot of time in reconnaissance on a network. On average, about 6 months, an APT will reside in a network before doing any damage. We've seen APTs reside in a network for a year, 2 years in some cases before, without doing anything. They're just doing reconnaissance on a network. They're trying to find the right areas, trying to see whether you're a high profile target and you're worth attacking and worth releasing the payload. And in a lot of cases they're using, not a lot of cases, but in some cases they're using zero-day exploits as a method of not initial intrusion, but obfuscation and getting a foothold on the device and the network, and they're very hard to spot. So in terms of the 90%, when we talk about web-based attacks, the numbers are pretty huge. In Q1 alone, Kaspersky detected over 2 billion attacks which was aimed at infecting a user's device through web pages. That could be redirecting to exploits, that could be malicious scripts directly inside the web page. It could be a site containing exploit itself, the downloading of malicious programs, botnet command and control servers, and so on. And obviously that number is pretty scary, and that's just a kind of tip of the iceberg in this regard. And of that 2 billion, round about 614 million were unique. So the pandemic's obviously highlighted this. Everyone's working from home. In a lot of cases with the corporate network now, we're on VPN, or we're a lot of cases we might disable the VPN while we're doing some work, so we're connected straight through our home router, and that kind of opens up doors that maybe aren't as well secure when you're going through a network perimeter as such. What's quite interesting actually is in the top 5 countries of sources of web attacks where they were distributing them, both the US and UK appeared in that top 5, which is quite surprising. Normally you would expect that to be more of a an Eastern kind of, should we say, methodology, where most of these attacks would be coming from China and or Chinese speaking entities. But yeah, the US and UK both appeared in the top 5, with Germany actually number 1 with 30.86% of attacks occurring, propagating from Germany. When we look at ransomware, actually ransomware is on a decline, believe it or not. I'll explain what I mean by that, but actually in terms of individual ransomware detections, it's on the decline, and it's been on decline for about 1.5 years now. We detected in Q1 around about 92,000 ransomware attacks onto devices protected by Kaspersky. And really, if we went back 2 years, that would be around about 250,000. There's a reason behind that, and I'll explain why that is. And in Q1, we detected 7 new ransomware families and about 4,400 new variants, which is the key thing with ransomware attacks. That's why they're hard to mitigate, is because each ransomware family some of them have over 1,000 different variants of their ransomware. And obviously there's a lot of backend, which I'll get to further on. Some of the interesting stuff regarding ransomware that we've seen is they've started to up their extortion tactics. So rather than just encrypting the files and holding you to ransom, they're leveraging other types of extortion as well to push you into it. Reveal, a kind of a key one here, and some people might know it, is sodding. And they've started to, once they've encrypted a target, they've also then started to threaten to DDoS that target. They send spam campaigns to the target. They call the client, they call the victim, or they call partners of the victim. So they will happily call, if you're a small company and you've been encrypted and you work alongside and you partner with a big company, they will start calling that big company to tell them that you've been infected with ransomware. They've also started calling the media to tell them about the attacks. And yeah, and obviously that is putting pressure on the victims to pay. I guess, again, we'll explain kind of what that means. The top detected ransomware during Q1 was still WannaCry. Surprisingly, obviously WannaCry was May 2017, but yeah, still across the general ransomware threat landscape, and this includes all types of devices, both corporate and home user. And WannaCry was still the most detected. And then a lot of generic verdicts, which indicates kind of lots of new variants and so on and so forth. And Reveal, obviously, down in the top 10. When we come to vulnerabilities that are being exploited, there's some obviously interesting information here. By far the most exploited area of a user's device is Office applications. There were some pretty, the most commonly exploited vulnerabilities were all found in Excel. There was kind of 3, as you can see the CVs here, and they were all pretty much aimed at using a stack buffer overflow attack to gain remote coding execution of the devices. What's really interesting here is these are the most common vulnerabilities that we saw executed across all devices, and the latest vulnerability of these was first identified in 2018. So it's over, the latest one of these is over 3 years old, and really just kind of highlight the necessity to regularly patch and update, which we'll get to. We also found during the quarter some vulnerabilities directly in Windows itself. One particular vulnerability allowed for privilege escalation within the Win32 subsystem, which allowed them to elevate their privileges and get more of a foothold inside the network. We also found 2 vulnerabilities directly in the Windows Defender antivirus engine. These vulnerabilities allowed for the elevation of user privileges to enable the execution of dangerous code. When it comes to browsers, which is the second most common vulnerability exploited inside in the industry, the biggest one was Internet Explorer, and web browser vulnerabilities were up around about 25% on Q1 from the previous year. The biggest one was found in Internet Explorer. This was allowed for remote code execution on the user's behalf, on the current users, and this vulnerability was being used by the Lazarus APT group. Lazarus APT group are the most prominent APT group that we track, and they were actively using this vulnerability to infect users' devices and execute malicious code. And then we also found 3 pretty strong vulnerabilities in Google Chrome as well, in a third-party browser. And another interesting find when it comes to vulnerabilities is there was a critical vulnerability found directly in vCenter within VMware, and this vulnerability allowed for remote code execution without any rights whatsoever, which is yeah, pretty scary stuff. So kind of an overview of just the kind of 90%, should we say? Yeah, obviously I won't go through all the numbers here, but there's huge amounts of attacks, and yeah, we're seeing pretty much the vast majority of our corporate users being attacks being attempted on them within that quarter. So when we go up to 9.9%, we can kind of talk about ransomware again. Obviously, I mentioned previously that ransomware was kind of on the decline, and it is in the overall numbers. But targeted ransomware and ransomware as a service is up, and up almost 700% on the previous year. And obviously, there's not a week goes by where we're not seeing kind of a high-profile target taken down by a ransomware gang. And what we've seen is a shift from the mass ransomware, affect as many users as possible and ask for small ransom demands. WannaCry was $300, the ransom demand, they upped it to $600. But now obviously we're seeing ransom demands of millions and millions and millions of dollars to get the data back. Reveal again has been a key player in this. They're one of the main ones for ransomware as a service, and you can see on the left-hand side their subscription offer. So ransomware gangs and on the dark web, they work very much like a reseller distribution market. They have incentives for attacking victims, successful attacks. There you get more money based on what the type of target you have, and so on and so forth. And really, what we're seeing obviously is a shift towards them actively going after high-profile targets. And sometimes, as we've seen with in the US recently, sometimes the actual ransomware authors are not always positive of the victims that have been attacked based on the reseller environment that they use. And again, what we're seeing in terms of targeted ransomware is a much more of a sharing of technology on the dark web. And on the right hand side here, you can see that an attacker is selling access to an organization's RDP. So then they would sell that onto a ransomware gang or another type of gang to infiltrate. So we're seeing a lot of cross-pollination, as it were, when it comes to different types of malware authors and different types of cybercrime gangs joining forces for the betterment of their business. And then once we go up to the kind of the APT factors, this is kind of what we've seen in Q1. Again, interesting for us actually is in my time at Kaspersky, and this is the first time that the UK has been in this top 12 countries of victims of APT attacks. It's hard to know why that is, whether it's geopolitical, whether it's down to the way in which we work now in the UK. Maybe the pandemic has affected our ability to secure ourselves. I know from my own research that although we're pretty strong in the UK on detecting threats, we're pretty bad when it comes to exploited vulnerabilities. So we're pretty low on that list, which may be why UK appears quite high on the list of top 12 targets. But however, this is obviously, the numbers here are pretty low. These top 12 equate to around about 20%. So if we opened it up to 40% of all the APT attacks, you'll see a lot of this atlas in red. So although this is pinpointed to the top 12, we're really talking about small amounts of percentages between the top 12 and the top 40, for example. So there's global coverage when it comes to APT threat actors. The top 10 targets was government, as kind of what you would expect, really. We're seeing a shift. So as we go through different years and different quarters of this, we're starting to see financial institutions rise up this list. And we might find that financial institutions become the most attacked target when it comes to APT threat actors, because we're seeing a trickle down with APT threat actors looking less at cyber and espionage and more at making money. So a bit of a blurring of the lines between the top two levels of the pyramid. And for us, the top 10 significant threat actors, number one being Lazarus. It's a very, very prominent North Korean speaking threat actor that have huge numbers of resources and scope to their attacks. So in terms of trends, obviously supply chain attacks have been huge. We all know, I don't think I need to go over the SolarWinds attacks. Obviously, everyone's aware of the issues with a poisoned kind of update within their Orion solution. It affected about 18,000 customers. It was a very, very complex attack, multi-stage, that used a Cobalt Strike backdoor to deliver additional payload to specific targets. So they were very bespoke. Although they hit 18,000 customers, the next stage is to actually do any real damage. They were very, very bespoke about their targets, very, very particular. And we've seen some co-similarities between Sunburst, which is what's been called the backdoor driver for the Orion attack, close to Kazur and the Duke's APT threat actors, but with very, very, very low attribution confidence. It's very hard to attribute. And obviously supply chain attacks are on the rise. I'm sure everyone remembers Expedia from a few years ago. That was a supply chain attack that was poisoned update into a Ukrainian accounting software, and that hit huge numbers of customers and caused billions of dollars of damage. And I'm sure we all remember the Maersk scenario, how they managed to survive. Maersk Shipping, they got hit for about $450 million of damages, but they were lucky to survive. They only survived the Expedia attack because they had two backup servers in Africa that were down for maintenance, and they were able to fly two people out on separate planes with some external hard drives to get all the backups of the data. Before that, they were doing all of their stuff at the docks on paper, pens and paper, so you can only imagine. We're also seeing, obviously, supply chain attacks into developers. So we've seen some in the Xcode spy. This is trying to run malicious or abusing run scripts within Apple's code development or developers, app development cycles that they use. And also some code COV attacks, which are exploiting errors in the Docker images. So where you may have a DevOps process inside a Docker container, exploiting attacks inside there. Obviously, the increasement of 0 days, we've seen obviously a lot very recently. Microsoft, I think, patched 5 0 days on one Tuesday, which is quite strong. This APT trickle down that we're seeing, APT trickle down, again, what we're starting to see more and more is where in the past APT gangs were very specific about their targets. They were generally cyber espionage or cyber sabotage against high profile targets. What we're starting to see is, and we believe we'll continue to see this even more, is the monetizing areas of APTs. If you think WannaCry ransomware again was attributed to Lazarus with high confidence, so that was a Lazarus created piece of ransomware, probably too successful, which is why it gained kind of notoriety. And we're starting to see this a bit more and more often, and I think this is why we're seeing this targeted ransomware. They're using APT level techniques to gain access to the network and penetrate the network, but then using ransomware on the back end. More sophisticated attack methods into non-PC targets. We're seeing a lot of UEFI malware infecting firmware and so on directly onto the machines. We're seeing an increase in sophistication. Again, UEFI specific malware, but also the use of legitimate cloud services like YouTube, Google Docs, Dropbox, Firebase as part of the attack infrastructure. And a really interesting one is deepfakes. So deepfakes is something that we're starting to see, and we think this is going to become a big, potentially a big issue for certain companies. We've seen it recently with Lazarus's threat needle activities and Deathstalker's efforts to pressurize victims into enabling macros with very sophisticated kind of faking components of their phishing. And very recently, we saw cyber criminals use AI software to mimic the voice of a senior executive, and that actually tricked a manager into transferring, I think, $50,000 to a rogue account, and they mimicked the voice of the senior executive of that company using AI technology. So, what can be done?
Sorry, Lee. I'm gonna have to cut you off in the next 60 seconds if you can wrap
Yeah, no
it up.
problem, that's fine. So, what we can do is at Kaspersky, what we tend to do is map kind of technologies and stuff to different layers of this pyramid. Some of the key things to do that most organizations that I speak to don't do enough is harden. App control, device control, web control. Most people have web control. Some have device control. Very little use app control to its full capabilities. Actively patching. Again, most organizations that I speak to have something in place for Windows, but very little in place for third party. And train your staff. It's very, very, very important. And there is stuff that you can do for free. You don't have to pay for stuff. You can actively review your user accounts rights, especially making sure that users that have left the business and their accounts are removed from Active Directory. Build a culture of trust, make your users comfortable with coming in and talking to IT and IT security about stuff that they might have seen or might have clicked on, and engage staff in cybersecurity. Follow, release, show them, share with them stories that you're seeing in your research about attacks that are happening. Obviously, patch. Read open source. Go and follow a couple of researchers on Twitter. Follow a couple of entities like Dark Reading on Twitter, and you'll get your finger on the pulse. You'll start to understand the new stuff that they're seeing and so on and so forth. And most of what I'm showing you today is available, was taken directly from our open source website, which is called SecureList, and test your backups. And I will share these slides with you, but these are just some of the free open source resources that Kaspersky supply in terms of the threat landscape and quarterly reports and access to a free sandbox and so on and so forth. So feel free to jot down any links that you particularly are interested in. And again, I will share these slides by PDF with anyone who needs them.